It is that time of year again when we are sending our kids back to school, but lots of parents have concerns about a possible teacher shortage. Is that real? If so, what does that mean for my children and your children? I cannot think of a better expert to come in and talk to us about this than Professor and Dr. Richard Ingersoll from the University of Pennsylvania. He is one of our country's leading experts on elementary and secondary teacher workforce. Hello, Dr. Ingersoll. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
I am so thrilled to have you just because this has sort of been your life's work to look into teacher workforces and all the things that go into what keeps and retains a teacher in a school, and what are those factors that have teachers leave schools. And I am wondering, and I know this is going to be a loaded question, are we seeing a teacher shortage nationwide right now?
Well, I'm sorry to give you a less than clear answer, but here's how it goes. Certainly, there's a huge amount of fear out there that because of COVID, we're having an increase in teacher retirements, of teacher quitting, and this is going to lead to shortages. That is, we're going to have large number of classes that are not staffed with qualified teachers. Mm-hmm. The reality is we do not have the data on this yet. It's anecdotal. It's superintendents here and there saying, listen, I'm running scared. Now, there was a whole prediction as part of this fear that with COVID, there was such stresses on teachers that we'd see a big surge in quitting amongst beginners and also amongst veterans retiring.
Sure.
The data, the research would actually suggest that would not be the case, and it doesn't look like it was the case in the beginning of COVID. That is, it doesn't matter how much you dislike your job, in economic downtimes, employees across the economy don't quit because there's not options out there. However, my own hypothesis, my own prediction has been that as the economy improves, as there's more options and alternatives out there for teachers and others, the quitting will go up and people decide, now I'm going to retire. But if the economy's iffy, or if there's not options out there, in this case for teachers, then they're going to stay in there. So it's a little murky.
Right. I mean, but generally we know that because of COVID and because of sort of the situation teachers were thrust into when they all of a sudden, with sort of no training and no support, had to start teaching remotely, and sometimes they had to do this hybrid thing. I mean, and lots of times we know this is probably not a surprise to anybody, but teachers don't always get all the support they need in order to do their jobs. So I could imagine and I'm sure, and this is what I'm going to ask you based on your research and your study of this, the stress that the teachers are under, the working conditions. Does it make sense that there would be sort of a mass exodus because of sort of the situation and where they find themselves? Along
with you, my assumption has been that there's been an increase in stress. There's also this whole polarization. Mm-hmm. Should schools be remote? Should they be in person? Should it be a hybrid? And most importantly, who decides? Should parents decide? Should it be the State Department of Education? Should it be the teachers? How much say should the teacher unions? And so given this environment, my own guess is there will be a surge in teacher quitting, both beginners and veterans. I'd be happy to be proven wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when we studied this over the decades, the big driver, the big factor behind teacher shortages has been pre-retirement teacher quitting. This is one of the things I documented in my research starting 20 years ago, was that the conventional wisdom is that we'd have these shortages because we weren't making enough new teachers. Mm-hmm. Had an increase in teacher retirements, an increase in student enrollments, not making enough.
Right.
And what I discovered is, no, that actually the big driver is not so much that we're making too few new teachers, is that we're losing far too many long before retirement.
Why? I mean, what is it that's making them quit so early and not be? I'm sure you don't get into being a teacher unless you love the idea of being a teacher. So clearly something is happening to drive them away pre-retirement. What is that?
You're asking the good question, the important question, the why question. We've spent so much time over the last couple of decades looking at the data, all kinds of data, self-report data from teachers who left. Why did you leave? And it always boils down to the job conditions, the working conditions. How attractive is that workplace? Putting aside the students, and contrary to conventional wisdom, salaries and benefits are not the major or the only source of dissatisfaction which drives teachers to depart.
That's interesting.
They're a factor, but they're not the main one, which is interesting because teaching overall is not the highest paid line of work.
Right.
But it's these things like how much voice, how much say do teachers have in the key decisions in the building that impact their jobs?
Sure.
Is it a thing where it's just top down, you do this, you do that, period? Or is there collective, is there group decision making where those on the ground, the teachers, get to have some input into these reforms that come down the pike? And things like that. It turns out that for the most part, teachers actually get a lot of blame, but they actually don't have much say in the decisions.
That's true.
But it varies by school.
Right.
And one of our data findings is schools in which teachers have more input into decision making and also more discretion in their classroom have far better teacher retention, and those buildings do not have shortages.
So I think, what I think is interesting that you said too, though, is the fact that the pay, because in your mind, the first thing you think when you see turnover is, well, they're not being paid enough. Let's just pay them some more, which of course teachers would say the pay is so low for a teacher. I think I wrote it down. Beginning teacher pay between $35,000 to $59,000, and that's probably on the very generous end for a new teacher. It's interesting you say that pay isn't the only thing. So besides giving the teachers more say, is there something else that should be done from the policy level, from the legislative level to fix this? Or should the government stay the heck out of the education for this reason?
Well, you mentioned this earlier. A second big aspect of the conditions, the characteristics in the schools and how they're run is the issue of support, particularly for beginning teachers. So we established a couple decades ago that there's this extremely high quit rates amongst beginning teachers in the first 5 years, that between 40 and 50% of those who go into teaching are gone within 5 years. And then it slows down. Those who have stuck it out decide, well, I'm going to make a career, and the turnover rates go way down. So what's behind these very early quit rates where you're losing an awful lot of people who long before they've had a chance to get really good at the job. So, it turns out support is a very big thing. So when I was a high school teacher, it went like this. It was called sink or swim.
Yeah.
You got the job. The principal gave you the key to their classroom, gave you a pat in the back, and that's it. You're on your own. You figure it out. Don't come to me for help. And so some would swim and some would sink. So the policy world figured out, this is starting a couple decades ago, that, gosh, this isn't really a way to manage a workforce. Let's develop support programs. For instance, let's have some really good veteran teachers be mentors of the new teachers to learn them how to survive and even maybe, succeed. So we've had a lot of these reforms. Often the word induction is used. They're support programs. We have strong research and data showing they work. They improve the teaching performance of the new teachers. They improve student achievement. They improve teacher retention. So back to your question, there's other things like support. That's another very big thing that can be done. And it could be done now in the face of these fears of a crisis.
Yeah. And I would imagine that support, because generally the support staff is generally already in place, I would imagine that offering the teachers the support that they're looking for that turns into this quit rate when they don't get it would be probably a less expensive option than just throwing more money at the problem.
Well, you're right. Now, being a former teacher, I'm certainly not going to argue against improving teacher salaries.
Yes, of course.
But you're absolutely right. These different things have price tags.
Mhm.
So it's not cost free, but there is some research showing that it's much better bang for buck than just throwing money at the system. You target it to these support programs.
Mhm.
Sometimes in the past, there's been federal money for this to help school districts. Sometimes there hasn't. So that's one of those things. And then the one I mentioned earlier about voice and autonomy, that's going to cost far less money to do that. I mean, that's a management issue.
Right.
Yes.
How much have you seen over the years of your research? Because it's quite frankly, it started before 2020, I would say, but it sort of ramped up after that. How much would you say the so-called or maybe even alleged overreach of like state governments banning books or parents getting aggressive at school board meetings against teachers or combative during parent-teacher conferences, how much of that kind of negativity plays into this teacher turnover?
Well, certainly that can be a big source of stress. So you mentioned two things. You mentioned sort of top-down reforms coming down from state governments.
Mm-hmm.
It might sound like a great idea, but a teacher could say, you know, that actually won't work. And so that's a huge source of frustration. Yes.
Sure.
And that does lead into quitting. The second one you mentioned is a very interesting and old issue. Parents and teachers, are they allies or are they enemies? There's nothing new about this. And think of it. The teachers are not making automobiles or something. They're taking people's children and trying to make them into adults in a sense. And so what the kids are taught, how they're taught, who teaches them, this, of course, is a subject of debate, and there's a lot of disagreement. And the big issue is, well, who gets the final say? Is it the parents or the teachers? These are not new issues. These have been a huge source of tension for teachers. The traditional complaint is, you know, everyone's bossing us around. You know, we're not treated like professionals. And by the way, you know, we're the experts. We're on the ground. Can we have more say? That's a very valid complaint. And that's linked to turnover. But on the other hand, let's face it, I mean, I'm a parent too.
Right.
I'm a former high school teacher. I'm a parent. The parents absolutely should have some say.
Right. Right.
So,
but I think you bring up a really interesting point because, you know, when it came out of my mouth, because, you know, right now as a journalist, I'm watching these things, I'm seeing these legislative policies come down about books and what you can and you can't teach and all of these things. So I'm thinking of it in the immediate. But then when I think back to my childhood in school, I can absolutely remember my parents getting upset about something that happened in a curriculum, you know, that I didn't think was a big deal as a kid, but like for them, it was a big deal. So this is an age-old problem. So while I would imagine, and I would not put words in your mouth, but while I would imagine it contributes to the stress, like you're saying, the pay, it's not the only thing that contributes to this exit factor.
You know, the issues aren't new at all. They've always been a tension. They're linked to teacher turnover, but you know, the resolution is maybe try to, you know, give the different groups a voice.
Mm-hmm. So I just back to where we began, which is, are we in a teacher shortage or will we be seeing a teacher shortage? Just to kind of button that part up. What I'm gathering your answer is we just don't know the facts yet because the data's not out. But anecdotally, we're seeing pockets of it throughout the country already. And it could get worse as we move forward.
That's a good summary. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And shortages in the past, it's not going to be all schools. It's not going to be all subjects. It's going to be mixed.
Mm-hmm.
Affluent suburban schools, they never had shortages. Low income, high poverty urban schools, more often than not had shortages. So it's probably going to be mixed. We don't have all the data yet, but certainly, you know, there are people out there to dismiss it. Well, you know, this isn't a problem. Well, you know, a lot of superintendents would say different.
In your travels and all of your study of this, is there something that parents can do to better the situation for teachers?
Well, if you press the school board, these kinds of job conditions I was talking about, yes, parents could do that. One of the things that's pained me is to see the degree of polarization in the last couple years where you'll get, there's animosity out there towards teachers, in particular teacher unions.
Absolutely.
It pains me to see that, and I get it. The pandemic has been, if a school goes remote, there's a big stress there on families with young kids.
Sure.
That is true. I get that. But teachers and schools and the unions are not the enemy. So
Right.
that's one thing, as I kind of lament what's happened. And
Right.
frankly, that's not going to make recruitment and retention of teachers any easier.
Right. Right.
Get it. There's some bad teachers out there. Yes, that's true.
Right.
And, some teacher turnover is good. We want some low performers to move on, but it's not good when there's the culture has some really negative stereotypes of teachers.
Right.
That has a negative impact, is my opinion.
Yeah. And then this is the $1 million question. And if you could answer this, I'm sure you would be making $1 billion everywhere. How do we fix this? How do we ensure, this isn't a problem? Because we know, of course, when there's teacher shortages and teachers are stressed and pulled so thin, the students obviously suffer. So how do we fix it?
Well, it's a deceptively simple answer. I think it goes like this, and it gets back to those working conditions, those job conditions I was talking about. This is oversimplified, but let's face it, well-paid, well-respected occupations and professions with good job conditions, they don't suffer from problems of recruitment, problems of retention. They don't.
Mm-hmm.
Law school at my university has a waiting list 3 miles long of people that want to get in.
Right.
There's not a shortage of lawyers. And so in some sense, if we could make teaching a more attractive job, and in some places it is, in some places it isn't, but I've been there and done that. And in this country, in many cases, it's not particularly well paid, not particularly well respected, doesn't have particularly good job conditions. And so we should be surprised that there's problems of recruitment and retention that crop up at certain times.
Well, Dr. Ingersoll, I so appreciate your time and your expertise today. This was very enlightening, and I'm sure a lot of the parents who are going to be watching this are going to say, you know what, maybe I'm going to do something a little bit nicer than usual from my kids' teachers.